Hi, everybody. Welcome to Popular Music Books in Process, a book series that's, with today's session, concluding 3 solid years and some 90 previous sessions across all the different categories of books that we could think of. Back episodes are on my YouTube page. I'm Eric Weisbard. My co-organizers, Carl Wilson, Francesca Royster, Gus Stadler, and Kimberly Mack have all done tons of work on this series, and we're very thankful for that. And we're a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, the IASPM US organization, which will be hosting its biannual global meeting in Minneapolis next week, and the Journal of Popular Music Studies. For today, we are joined by Imani Kai Johnson, Grace Shinae Jun, and Rosemarie Roberts, talking about the Oxford Handbook of Hip Hop Dance Studies, which Imani co-edited, as well as Imani's own solo project, Dark Matter in Breaking Ciphers, The Life of Africanist Aesthetics in Global Hip Hop. So we'll talk a lot about hip hop street dancing and ways in which this field opens up into broader topics in Africanist aesthetics as well. So I'll quickly offer the bios of the different presenters today, and then turn it over to them for the session. Imani Kai Johnson is an interdisciplinary scholar specializing in the African diaspora, hip-hop dance, and structures of power. She's an associate professor of critical dance studies and the Department of Black Study at UC Riverside, and as mentioned, the author of Dark Matter and Breaking Ciphers, The Life of Africanist Aesthetics in Global Hip Hop, out on Oxford Press this year, which explores the unseen or invisibilized Africanist aesthetics embedded in the ritual dance circle called the cypher. Dr. Johnson also, along with Mary Fogarty, co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Hip Hop Dance Studies, and is founder and artistic director of the Show and Proof Hip Hop Studies Conference Series. Rosemarie Roberts is the Dayton Professor of Dance at Connecticut College, where she holds an endowed professorship in the interdisciplinary study of the arts. Her artistic and scholarly work blends social science, history, dance, and theater to conduct investigations of Afro-diasporic dance as embodiments of difference, knowledge, and resistive power. In addition to her dance practice and dance making, Dr. Roberts has published more than 20 articles and book chapters, co-authored a book, authored a second book project entitled Bearing Unbearable Sensualities, Hip Hop Dance, Bodies, Race, and Power with Wesleyan University Press, and is the president of the Dance Studies Association. And I think should be mentioned, a contributor to the Oxford Handbook as well. Finally, Grace Shinae Jun is a mother, wife, artist, and scholar who moves on the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation, the daughter of a South Korean immigrant and a North Korean refugee. She comes from a lineage of deep love and commitment to serve the people. Grace directs BK Soul, co-founded Asian Solidarity Collective, co-conspires with street dance activism, and loves to get down in the club. She received her MFA from Sarah Lawrence College, her PhD in drama and theater through the joint doctoral program at UCSD-UCI, co-edited with Mary Park the Cyber Rock mixtape, a virtual hip-hop dance listening cipher. Grace teaches at San Diego City College with Transcendence Youth Arts and at the University of California, San Diego, where she was the recipient of the 2023 Barbara and Paul Saltman Distinguished Teaching Award. So I'm going to turn things over to Rosemarie in just a second here and urge all of those here for the session to use the chat actively during the conversation. You can do 2 things there. You can simply put comments, things you think of as the conversation goes. We'll send that text on to the presenters after the session has concluded. And then you can also ask direct questions. Carl Wilson will conduct the Q&A, calling on those who've put questions in the chat in the order that the questions came in. And for now, let me turn it over to Rosemarie, and welcome to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, and thanks for everybody for showing up. I guess I want to start with one question, which I think will, give the presenters some things to talk about, whether it's your own, in Imani's case, your book, and your book and the Oxford handbook, as well as Grace. So, as we know, until recently, studies of hip hop culture have focused most squarely on rap music. And even as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of hip hop, attention continues to more so be on rap music. And the publications that we're talking about today seek to explore hip hop dance and dance studies, in part because of their inextricable linkages between music and dance. So could you address your treatment of these linkages in your work? Imani, why don't we start with you?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and happy to start. Thank you both, Grace and Rosemarie, for participating. So in terms of thinking about the 50th anniversary of hip hop and the tendency in hip hop studies to focus on rap music, or the continued tendency, I would say even just the 50th anniversary is its own way of specifying a rap music centric approach to thinking about hip hop. The dances that all now fall under or can come under the umbrella of hip hop, far exceed that 50th anniversary, and there are ways of interpreting that history that, if we center dance, might shift that narrative a bit. For me, in my own research, I wrote about what I was referring to as the aural, AURAL, kinesthetic, thinking about the relationship between movement and dance, because I was paying attention to dances that happened to music. Like, people were interpreting the music, they were engaging the music. It was part of the conversations and the ciphers. It was what was inspiring the things that I was focusing on. And it was challenging coming up more so through American studies, ethnic studies, literature, and then anthropology and performance and dance ethnography. It was challenging to find conceptual resources that allowed me to talk about a simultaneity that in scholarship often gets separated out. So we'd have these amazing discussions, these very kind of intricate and technical discussions of music, and sometimes, also technical discussions of dance and social dances and dances, hip hop dances, street dances kind of fell in the gap between the two, and trying to figure out how to talk about these things as happening simultaneously. I worked on what I refer to as the aural kinesthetic, which to me was just kind of a general term. And so I was really, I'm coming up with this concept at the same time that Ashan Crawley eventually, publishes about the choreosonic. And the choreosonic, I think, has a very political valence to it. And then as I'm doing more readings in African diasporic music, you're seeing people say, like, movement is always there, like it's always part of it. Gesture and dance are always part of it. So, and some people came up with language for that, and some people kind of didn't, but everybody's attending to it. So I realized that I think of my concept more as a general way of thinking about, movement and sound and what's happening synergistically there. But then there are a multitude of other concepts that I think allow for more specific analysis, especially with regards to power and things like that. So yeah, I think about that relationship to music, and that there's really a wide range of work attending to that. We just haven't given it a lot of attention as much, I don't think.
Grace, what about you? What do you see as, or what opens up for you when you think about those linkages between music and dance?
First, I would like to just express some gratitude to Dr. Johnson and Dr. Roberts, who I look up to immensely and whose work is influencing my work. I think about when I was writing my dissertation, the things that I could have used. Both your could have helped me articulate better what I was thinking about. And so thank you. And also to Dr. Schloss, who's joining us here today. His book on breaking was probably one of the only movement texts that really helped me think about hip hop specifically. And I think a lot about, I'm a mover, I'm a practitioner. So we move, we can always move, but we often move when we hear great music. And so for me, it was always about how can I write about this thing that I love doing. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I grew up pop movement where there were no classes, where it was a social dance that you did with your friends. And as I went to college, all the scholarship was on hip hop music, but thinking about how can we write about dance? How can I write about dance as a mover? How can I write about performance as someone who is rooted in movement? So I think both your books and the handbook are really important to center dance in this way, because I think a lot about hip hop would not continue without the dance. Right, that rap or music is could be the hyper commercial side of it, but in our communities it continues because of the dance, because of the clubs, because of the communities it creates.
And it's precisely that they work together, right? So Kool Herc's innovations are because he is responding to what dancers are doing, but it's all synergistic. Dancers are doing based on what he decides to play or not play. And there's a conversation there. And I think the thing that gets missed when we separate out these mediums is that there's a relationship there that you're deleting or erasing when you don't acknowledge or even kind of spend time about what you can understand from that. The piece I wrote on oral kinesthetic was studied on, was published on the Sounding Out Sound Study blog. And I titled it Music Meant to Make You Move, because at the time when I was trying to find out language, it was really more like I had come to understand as a kind of late stage dance scholar that at the very least, I knew that how people were moving to certain things held information that if I didn't know how to move to it, I didn't have access to. And one of my primary examples is go-go music. So go-go music out of DC, the first time I heard it, it just seemed really fast and I didn't quite get it. And there was, I'm from California. So I didn't know how to reconcile with it at the time. I was really young. And I remember being at a concert and there was a live go-go band on and I'm waiting for the hip hop band to come on after. It's during Howard's homecoming. And this band is playing and people are dancing and this woman gets so excited and she's so into it. She rips her shirt off and just waves it above her head and she's going. And all I remember thinking is like, I'm missing something. Like there's something I don't get that she's getting like in an embodied way. And I at least understood, I started to pay attention to and understand movement as a way to find a point of entry into a different kind of appreciation. And so that was something that always stuck with me. And I think is part of how I landed on dance as the thing to pay attention to. And also, Grace, I love that the piece that you and Mary published, tell me the name again, because I love that it is this playlist, this mixtape approach that is still about dance.
The cyber rock mixtape.
Yeah. And you have, why mixtape?
We kind of set it up as like almost like an album where you could choose. You could go out of order. You could listen to it straight. You have both you and Joe are contributors to that. We had two dance practitioners in conversation with each other, and then a scholar make a response to their conversation. But a mixtape in the sense of we're pulling, right? I mean, I don't know folks here, but I remember getting those, when CDs came out, like making mixtapes, and that was a process of combining your favorite songs, or if you were, I remember like being into somebody, like making a mixtape of songs that I like to share with them, right? Like this is a little bit of me. I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah. I also wanted to say, I think about hip hop music as something you can consume in a way, like well, now it's obviously digital, but growing up, you owned a CD, or you owned a cassette tape, or you owned a record. And dance you can't really consume in that same way. Only kind of more recently with social media and YouTube could you see dance, and it would change every time. So thinking about why people focus more on music, because it existed in a way that you could access it over and over again. Whereas dance, it happened and it was gone. Even though there were, recordings of jams and battles and things, it didn't quite capture it in the same way as being in the space. So I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, people didn't have access to cameras as a common thing necessary, video cameras for a long time. But I've always been struck by how vividly memories of certain ciphers can live with people decades later. Like I've had people tell me their cipher stories. My opening question with any interview was typically like, do you remember your first cipher? Which is it's not even formed as a question. It's just more like, tell me a cipher story. And everybody had at least one. It might not have been their first, but they had at least one story where they were just like, oh, and then and this person, and it's this whole drama. But when you're in a cipher, you recognize that drama it's intricate. It's an exchange with who else is there. It's an exchange with the music and the DJ. It's an exchange with memories of what you did the last time you were in a cipher. It's all of these things happening, and you can do amazing things that you don't expect. You surprise yourself. You can do something you actually can't do again, but you did it in that one moment. There's so much to that, and I'm always struck by how vivid the memory can live with people, and that also tells us something. So even when you don't have a recording, it's very meaningful to recognize that somebody can talk about something they did as a teen or in their 20s, and they're in their 50s, and they can give you a little example, and they can tell you, who did what run or whatever. And that's to me is a rich kind of source of information as well.
Yeah, I also think about when we start to write about how the body is implicated in movement, just generally speaking, movement of any kind, doesn't have to be dance. Then there's this sensory connection that you just alluded to, Imani. So it's not only what we're hearing, it's also what we're feeling, and then what we're feeling and hearing and seeing, and it's almost like our perception kind of opens up, and then it's also about energy. Being in a room with music, and I think it makes me think about how when I was writing about dance, or when I was doing my doing that study that I did that is based on a Jacob's Pillow, and watching these OGs teach, there was also this sense of what was happening in between the beat, like the marked beat, or like with this dance that I've been trained in, that I teach, is Afro-diasporic dance, Brazilian, Haitian, Cuban, and the clave, and where people are moving. It's with and one, what's happening in that and space. So I think that when we're writing about dance and we're articulating this kind of embodiment of energy and embodiment of sound, that something is starting to get articulated differently. When when we're looking at this relationship of movement,
Yeah,
and music.
Because even with dance, like even when I'm not writing about dance, and I noticed a comment in the chat from Rob Drew about the DJ. I've been struck by, like, I had a conversation with somebody who talked about, and he said it briefly as like a passing thing and not like my next article is going to be on, because I was like, so when's that article coming out? But it wasn't happening. But he was talking about the gestures, like when a DJ is doing certain things, there's certain gestures and they can cultivate certain sounds. And there's already then a correlation between what they're trying to achieve, orally, and what they're doing physically. And I think that physical part doesn't always get articulated in the larger scheme of what's happening with the music, but that's really fascinating to me. Like, I'm very curious then what that physical opens up. And do you feel sometimes, like, do you kind of missed something or you hit something cool because of how it felt in the body versus maybe what you were trying to achieve or what actually came out? I think that there are elements there that are potentially really, really rich, especially because so much of it is it's a communal thing. These are, people are there. There's social relations that get produced in those moments. There are relationships that begin by virtue of like vibing on that same song in the same circle. And so I'm curious about bringing movement to the discussion of a lot of things, not necessarily as dance, because again, I said I was late to dance studies. I'd done a lot of research and a lot of reading and prep work in grad school around dance ethnography. But I didn't know dance studies was a field. And so there was an element of dance studies as a field that I had missed. So dance ethnography I had access to. And I came to that more so through anthropology, and my own background was in literature. I was an English and economics major. So the literature, the kind of literary approach, storytelling approach, analysis approach is how I kind of engage dance. And I bring that up just because for those who are concerned or intimidated about writing about movement because it's challenging. For me, it wasn't that I was trained up in it and I knew all the words. It was more like I can communicate how I'm interpreting this or how it's making me feel or what it's moving in me. I can start to put words into that. And so in my own writing, my focus is more that as opposed to a kind of technique driven approach that wasn't my training. And to whatever degree I learned stuff, I didn't learn it in a way that felt like I can just throw out language or I did a such and such. Like I can't depend on that language in that way. So that's just encouragement for those who can engage movement a bit more in their own analyses, that you don't have to have all the technical language down to do it.
Grace, you were going to jump in there, I thought.
Right, I think it's gone.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Well, maybe you can take up this next question before we move to questions from participants and people who are here. So what opens up when we study hip hop through the lens of dance ethnography, and as well as the Africanist aesthetics?
Well, for me, my contribution to the handbook is on Asian American participation in hip hop dance. And so for me, it's a lot about identity or finding self within it. I know for me, I credit a lot to hip hop dance to helping me figure out who I was as a person, how I related, how I thought about things. And so my study really looks at that, and I continue to look at that, and seeing my students, particularly my non-Black students, trying to navigate what it means to participate in hip hop culture, a Black cultural art form, but also figure out who they are. And right at this critical moment of being at college, being away from home, trying to navigate relationships, and figure out what they want to study and how they want to move forward. Most of my students are non-dance majors, so really coming into the movement as a way of having fun, I would say, trying to be cool, but then through that process, understanding something about themselves. And then I think particularly with that, looking at from the African aesthetics, it really frames a way to look at the movement that is non-Eurocentric, and I think allows, I would say, for more possibility in terms of understanding, because I think our young people, particularly in dance, are so trained or think about dance in a very particular way, and that they often think of dance as this one thing, and they don't consider movement and dance to be broader than what they think. And I know I emphasize it. I'll just say there was a moment I was teaching a hip hop dance and culture class this quarter, and I started with the African aesthetics, and one of my students brought up a rapper. I can't even remember. We have these conversations about, real hip hop, 80s, 90s, golden era versus like 2020 rappers. And he made a comment about the rapper possibly using high effect juxtaposition. And it was great because at the moment I was like, no, I don't know, but I see your point. I see how you're using this theory to talk about how this rapper goes from really having fun to getting really serious, or being super flippant about something, but like driving a message home. So I had an experience where I might have not necessarily agreed, but this theory helped the student understand a process of a hip hop artist that maybe he wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, because I think those aesthetics exist across different forms of expressive culture, and that's part of what makes them so powerful to me. So I would love to also then hear from Rosemarie about your contribution to the anthology, and talking a bit about that. It is, for those who aren't aware, I have to look for myself, it's broken into 5 parts. There are 28 chapters or 29 chapters if you count the introduction and the conclusion chapter, the afterword, written by Dr. Schloss, who is here. And we've got sections on hip hop dance legacies and traditions, hip hop dance methodologies, overstanding identities and hip hop street dance practices, breaking with convention, and hip hop health, injury, healing, and rehabilitation. So those are the sections. And it's a combination of artists, scholars, and artist scholars contributing to the anthology. I'd love to hear from Rosemarie about telling folks what you contributed.
So the title of my chapter is Living in the Tension, the Aesthetics and Logics of Popping. And it centers on the teaching, or I begin with talking about Mr. Wiggles' teaching. And he's teaching popping in this class. And one of the things that he said was that you have to hold a certain amount of tension when you're popping, but then you also have to be very clear in terms of how you release it. So, and he says you have to go from 0 to 100 miles per hour, and then back again. And I was taken with this, like, what is that? This thing about holding tension, and what does that do for us? What does that tell us? And it made me think about, for example, in Afro-Cuban dance, and if you look at many different kinds of Afro-diasporic dance, there's a kind of a holding back that is expected. In other words, you never just release all of the energy when you're moving. The movement just doesn't you never let go completely. There's always this kind of drawing and dancing within the music and with the music and with others, but there's never a complete release. And it made me think, why, why is this happening? What's the importance of this? And I think that, when I think about the Africanist aesthetics, I think that that's sort of what sits at the bottom, that this tension is a tension that speaks to kind of more social tensions that we are all in all the time. But also these tensions around power and power relations, power, depending on where you sit in the hierarchy. But this idea of like never letting anything go completely, because if you do, in popping, for example, and by the way, I'm not a popper, I don't dance, I'm not a hip hop dancer, but just from studying it and watching it and listening to these, ace OGs teach, there's a way in which, when you're teaching, and sort of been in my experience as well, when you're teaching dance, as Grace said, for many young people, there's this idea that technique sits over here and everything else is over here, like that they're not at all related, but that there's a kind of, but when you bring them together, when you bring the history of whatever form you're teaching, or whatever form you're learning, all of that richness that has brought about this movement over time, that there's a kind of, when you bring that in, you can no longer just dance as if you're letting everything go or holding everything back, that there's this kind of relationship between them that you're moving through. And to me, that was just just like a really cool way of cool, but also it was a more nuanced way of understanding popping on it, on its own terms, but also all of the kind of how much goes into the movement of any form that we do, that there is this kind of almost like a remembering, a bringing together of the, of us as people, as individuals, but also to kind of a collective experience that is, I think that is important in understanding when we dance, when we teach dance, when we listen to music, and when we dance. So I hope that kind of illustrated a little bit.
This is a good sampling of the anthology as well, because your piece, Rosemarie's in the Breaking with Convention section. Grace, yours is in the one around identities and practice. And then I have two pieces in the methodology section. I interviewed, just in the course of my own research for the book, I came across a number of women ethnographers, women identified ethnographers of hip hop dances. And that was fascinating to me. So I was like, why? And why so many? And what are folks working on? So I took advantage of having to submit something to my own anthology to just ask and spend time. And I had so much information that it turned into two articles. One talks about the corporealities of being a women ethnographer of hip hop dances, and the other looks more closely at what I refer to as critical hip hopography, and that's a term coming from James Beatty, hip hopography. And so thinking about what from a hip hop perspective are the kind of imperatives in terms of methods in doing research, ethnographic driven research in hip hop communities, with a dance angle and a particular understand the understandings that come from the range of experiences of women ethnographers themselves. And there was so much that I was surprised there was so much. Like, I can tell you for sure, one of the delays for the anthology was me with all these interviews, and I was like, I don't know, I don't know what to do. There's so much information. So yeah, I'm excited about what all is going to come out. because I think for you, Grace, we invited you into the anthology with a piece that I don't know if you had ever planned to have published or to publish. I had seen you present some. I was like, I want to hear more. But what brought you to that study?
I think, like I said earlier, was just my own practice of understanding who I was as an Asian American, teaching and studying and living through hip hop culture, and then being in an institution where the dance teams just kept growing. The culture of the dance teams kept growing. And then I would have students come to my class and tell me, oh, I need to learn foundations. I need to learn what hip hop is. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting that there's so many young people practicing a form that they don't understand where it comes from or what foundations actually is. And I think I was really critical at first. But working through it, I'm seeing the ways that they are really struggling, that there's this unsettling and ungroundedness of how they situate themselves. So my studies in part to understand myself better and then understand themselves, help to mentor them to understand themselves better and to do better, honestly, because I think of how anti-Black racism is so embedded in our cultures and the way that we practice hip hop. So me being someone that wants them to figure out how to participate with a whole heart and with a gracious heart, really. And then I think, Imani, I was at the CORD conference where I heard your paper. And so that was really inspirational to me because you were writing about it as well, right? So, and then you asked. I was one of the later contributors to the anthology, but I was really excited to further this, and I think it's really propelled me in the direction I want to go with my work. So much gratitude.
That's cool. That's very cool.
I also want to, if I may, add that I think I approach, well, I know I approach writing about dance and hip hop dance as a knowledge making, knowledge production. So from a standpoint of epistemology, that's how I see it, and this idea of meaning making. And so in my contribution, I start to talk about the aesthetics of illusion that I then expand on in my book. And so those are just some ideas that help to ground this felt experience. And I think that's the thing that I'm always kind of interested in, is this kind of felt experience and how I can articulate that and maybe even translate that, and so one of the inspirations for me was in addition to Dr. Johnson, was Dr. Slaus's work, early work on foundations, his book. So
yeah.
I mean, I think about both of your concepts of, I don't know if you would say that the thing that's not there, or maybe the thing that's not seen, right? Like Imani, your book is dark matter, and Rosemarie, you have this concept of social ghosts, right? So it's like what's there, and then kind of what's there, but we're not maybe kind of attuning to, right?
Yeah. I think about it as what's the reason I really love the dark matter metaphor, which is a concept coming out of physics about materiality that we don't yet know how to see, and that kind of reads as translucent. So can't see it, don't know when, if we're touching it, but it's there and it makes up the majority of matter in the world. I was really fascinated by it as a metaphor. It becomes what has been invisibilized. So taking Benedict Gosciel's term in invisibilization, what's been invisibilized in dance is the Africanist presence, right? So I was always struck by that there's something here, we're all experiencing it. it continues to influence what comes next. It continues to influence how expansive hip hop becomes. And also, we don't know how to see it. And it's been invisibilized in a lot of ways because you're encouraged to kind of consume Black culture and actively not have to think about context and history and things like that. Especially with dance, it's treated as ephemera that goes away, and just take of it as you wish and keep it moving. Because that's encouraged, it encourages an invisibilization of these elements that are really profoundly impactful to what hip hop is, as well as how it spreads in the world. But I will say I'm also really proud of the fact that the anthology created space for practitioners to publish, and to publish their perspectives, their insights. Some of it is around history, some of those insights are around kind of personal experience, some are about technique, and just a range of things. But if we're going to name and talk about and bring attention to hip hop dance studies, that necessarily includes practitioners' voices and perspectives, and it's not and can't possibly be a solely kind of academic driven approach. Everything I've come to understand, so much of that was really spending time with dancers and listening and learning. And this is just like all of this work is just my contribution to the cypher, my addition to the conversation. But that they're experts in their bodies in ways that words were never meant to go. My job is to try to get some closer to it. But yeah.
Carl, I see you. Should I go ahead and read one of the questions that Lucretia, she starts us off?
No. What we try to do. This is why I facilitate it, because we sort of call on people to ask the questions themselves, to unmute and ask.
Okay, cool.
But I didn't want to cut. I wasn't trying to cut the conversation off if Grace or anybody had anything they wanted to add in on the end of what Imani was saying there. Nope. Okay. In that case, we will go to questions. We've got a few, and there's time for people to add more as we go. Joe Schloss, you were first in. I don't know if you feel like your question was addressed. Maybe if you do, you might have other things you want to throw into the mix.
Yeah, let's come say hi. Tell us about your contribution to the anthology.
Joe, you still there?
There he is.
Little technical. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I would still be interested to hear people's response to it. It was something that I talked a little bit. So they very kindly asked me to write an afterword. So, which is great because it's rare as an academic that you get a chance to read through other people's things and say what you like about them, as opposed to what you want to criticize about them. So for somebody like me, that was just a wonderful experience and a wonderful opportunity, and I'm very thankful for it. So my question, I guess they haven't seen the questions. So do you want me to ask my question?
Yeah, please just go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to take advantage of this for a second and I was in the middle of typing a comment at this moment, so I just want to say my comment, which is, Imani, in regard to what you were just saying, I also have started to feel over the last couple of months that there's an inherent value to including practitioners in an anthology, and I think that was something that was I found very valuable about the anthology. I think there's also secondarily a value to doing that in terms of setting a standard for future scholarship, which I think is really important. For me personally, I would even go farther than that in terms of saying setting a standard and shaming other hip hop scholars if they don't do that. But you could also make that argument in maybe a less intense way. But in any case, I think it's very valuable symbolically as well as in terms of its actual contribution. But recently I've been noticing that I feel like some of the people that have either contributed to the anthology or just interacted with really all three of you, but particularly you, Imani, and Kenny in particular, I'm thinking of. I feel like they're actually engaging and developing their own, like, I think it's been valuable to them to participate in terms of developing the way they themselves think about their own history. And so I think that's just something I've observed over the last year or two, that I feel like people your contribution in particular has pushed people to step back from their own experience and look at it from a more of a critical distance and realize that that's a thing that can be done. And I think that's going to really bear fruit in the future. Which I guess ties into my question, so I really appreciated that on all three of those levels. But my question was just what you think the study of hip hop dance has to offer to hip hop studies in general. Obviously, that's something I wrote about a little bit in my chapter, but I'm just curious on your perspectives on that, if you have thoughts on it. And
I mean, your chapter was very thorough and thoughtful, and I was so happy. I was like, so glad we got Schloss to do that, because it's just something that, you know, you see it and you're like, oh, it needed this, and I wouldn't have thought to engage it in the way you did. You have this really, y'all should read the chapter. It's awesome. And for me, I feel like hip hop dance, one of the things I want to contribute is just a comfort in paying attention to and engaging with movement and gesture and dance as a part of how we understand the world. It's not a separate category for those who spend their whole life doing it and thus should be, you know, only of interest or concern, or a capacity for those folks. And so I always acknowledge that I came late to dance studies because I want folks to recognize that it wasn't necessarily in my training. I've always been a social dancer. So there was something in that. I knew there was something in dance because I feel it. But in the writing of it and spending time and just acknowledging it. And then now I'm in a dance department and I teach dance studies courses. One of the things I say to students in a general ed course that I teach who are only taking dance because they think we're gonna, I don't know what they think we're gonna watch YouTube videos and TikToks and call it a day. But one of the things I want them to pay attention to is you already know you have a beginning understanding of how to read bodies. You do it every day. You know when somebody's walking to you in a threatening way or in a flirtatious way. You know how to read the gestures of family you've been with for years and years, and a little thing can signal something is about to happen or they're really happy. You know how to read that. So I feel like just because we're in a society that teaches a kind of version of knowledge that, you know, gives credence to certain forms over others, that movement element is there. And if we actually actively engage it, there's just a deeper understanding of hip hop. I just did a conversation with two other contributors to the anthology, Anthony De Niro, aka B-Boy Why Not, and Carlos Mayer 139, who did the cover art for the anthology. And they both really talk about how engaging with multiple hip hop elements deepens an understanding of what hip hop is, what hip hop culture is, and their relationships between them. So they both kind of look at and engage the overlap between graffiti and breaking, or writing and breaking, but also visual representation and the relationship between the elements, and the music element is always also there too, because we're talking about dance, which means we're also talking about music. And the music in those spaces isn't just rap music. It's the original breaks that become the samples that set off the golden age of hip hop. So all of that is part of the conversation too. And I think that dance reminds us that all of those pieces come together: the DJ, the writing, the rapping, the movement, the knowledge, all of that is encapsulated in dance as well. That's what I would add. I don't know about the other two.
Grace, what do you think?
I mean, yes to everything Imani said, but I I think about when we stop and pause to be in our bodies, to think about our bodies, the way that we move, the why, the whys of how we move, and where it gets us, and then it leads to hopefully it leads to a deeper process of understanding hip hop and culture and community building. Really, I mean, I would say hip hop has really formed the basis of how I move through the world, right? But in the sense of like, it's connected me to people that I might not necessarily connect with, right? That you get into the club, you get into a space and you move together, you sweat together, and you build relationships together. So I think we think of it as like dance or music, but I think beyond that of like how we can build community and make changes that way.
I think when I started to learn and study quote unquote traditional Afro-diasporic dance, one of the things that I learned was that it was a way for people to tell a history and a kind of experiences that were either submerged completely, if not completely invisibilized. And so I approach hip hop dance as I was studying it in the same, with that same idea. What more can we know about a people who've come together, about a people who, whether it's, in the club or in a classroom, what more can we know about these kind of invisibilized experiences and histories if we focus on dance? And so to me, that was really an important exploration that motivated me to write about hip hop dance specifically, and to study hip hop dance, and to teach dance, more generally. Just and teaching in a college where young people, even if they've been studying dance since they were very young, still bring this sensibility around dance that it's about a technique, and all dance, but specifically Afro-diasporic dance, and if you consider hip hop as part of that, is often taught in a deracinated way. Pulls it away from its roots, it pulls it away from the streets, it pulls it away from all of these really important roots. So what can we know if we kind of bring these together again?
That's awesome. Thank you. Lucretia Ty Jasmine, could you unmute and raise your question?
Sure. Thank you all so much. This is so interesting to me. And I wish I'd read all this and heard all this before I just finished writing something, because I really needed this. So it's reminding me though of jazz and swing, because there was a Benny Goodman concert, and there was also like 20 years later a Duke Ellington concert, and the concerts just came alive because of the dancers, and the musicians on stage said that. Anyway, so I just wanted to mention that because I just keep thinking about that with hip hop. And so I'm just curious though, how would you three each describe any of the dances in hip hop? And then how would you all describe movement in rap?
Say more, what do you mean by that?
Like, okay, so if there's a hip hop style of dancing, and let's say there's a rap style of dancing, what does it look like to you? Like, how would you describe it?
I probably wouldn't separate them out in that way. And I definitely probably wouldn't talk about hip hop as a singular way. All of those things I would say kind of fall under the umbrella of hip hop, which is not to say that they're exclusively hip hop, but they can be read in and through hip hop. I've occasionally heard the term rap dancing, but I don't know if it's actually a separate category. I think it's maybe a colloquialism that has regional or localized use depending on where you're at. Yeah, it's not a term I come across a lot. But if you're asking about a distinction between the kind of the techniques that often get named first under the umbrella of hip hop, so breaking, popping, locking, versus the hip hop social dances that generated around the golden era of hip hop when rap music was really coming into prominence. I mean, I would probably talk about them in those terms, which is to say those specific genres, they have elements to them. And then the people who teach those practices, those techniques can way more accurately attend to the specificity of those genres. When I write, I feel like I write about the feel of it, both because that's the thing that is most salient for me and the thing that I think I can best communicate to others who don't have an experience with it. And so the feel of those dances might shift and change. Grace and I are similar ages, and I grew up in that moment where hip hop social dances were a thing. Like that was my junior high and high school. They are, I might occasionally go to a class where they're going to teach some classic movement. I was like, oh, you're just doing such and such. Like I learned that in my friend's bedroom before we went to the school dance in like the 7th grade. So yeah, my relationship to those things are just all different. Breaking was something I saw on TV as a Cali girl, a generation and a half kind of behind those original breakers. And some, I saw it and was fascinated, and I wanted to understand and learn more, and really didn't get to spend time until the dissertation research. And so I will concede that there was a portion of my dissertation research that was really just the kid in me being like, I'm gonna do this. Like I get to spend time with these breakers that I saw on TV when I was like 8. So because I didn't understand why I was so fascinated, why I was so drawn to it. I'd seen popping my whole life, grew up in the Bay, so it was kind of always present, but not necessarily immediately in my circles. And I thought it was cool, but there was something about breaking that drew my attention. And so I think that, people have different relationships to different genres of hip hop dance, but those social dances were an opportunity to embody the rhythms and the feel of what was happening in the music of that era, what now gets called the kind of golden era of hip hop. And yeah, I think in any given context, a key thing to understand, the key thing that I got out of talking about oral kinesthetics and reading about African aesthetics and recognizing this is part of, Black music, essentially, that you're embodying the music. This is a physical manifestation of a relationship to the music that is the same as a musician. It's just a different form. So I learned that, I really learned to pay attention to like, oh, what are you dancing to? What are you hearing? What are you feeling? And it might be different in the same song than what I'm paying attention to, but that gives, we have this dynamic with the rhythm that is part of the dynamic with African aesthetics. And so, yeah, I don't even know if I'm fully addressing your question, but that's what comes to mind. And giving the floor to others to respond.
I mean, I could just extend a little bit what you're saying, Imani. I think, a lot of scholars and practitioners will say breaking and party dances or social dances are the foundation of hip hop dance. And then you have these other forms like popping and locking developing on the West Coast. People will even, incorporate crumping or Memphis juking or Chicago footwork, like all these other forms under the umbrella of hip hop. And then you have choreography, which is kind of where the focus has been, where people say you'll go to a hip hop class and all you learn is choreography. So that's really kind of up to the interpretation of who the instructor is. And this is what I was commenting earlier about my students' unsettledness about what they're doing. And to think that, oh, if we just include popping and breaking and a little bit of this, then we're doing hip hop dance, as opposed to when the music turns on, what do you do? Do you start doing steps, or can you groove and get down to the music? Or do you start doing choreography? Yet growing up, like Imani, waiting lunchtime, doing the Roger Rabbit, doing the Running Man. Like this is what we did as young people. But I know I was really influenced by the Fly Girls. I wanted to be a Fly Girl on In Living Color, the comedy skit, but they had the dancing scene, right? But that was also choreography as well, with maybe a little bit of improvisation. But ultimately, I'll say the music turns on. What are you going to do? Right.
That's great.
Kind of organically.
Oh, sorry, Rosemarie, go ahead.
What you're going to do organically. I think, what is this? What is this being drawn out of you by the music? But then there's, all of these different hip hop styles or dances. Like they all got created on this. They all get, not they all got. It's not past tense. It's happening every single day. That young people are getting together and grooving and moving, and they are choreographing. And it's happening on the streets. And then now we, social media, and you see it, young people are like, but that's always been the case. And my personal jam is house. So, but, some people's like, that's not part of hip hop, but that's what was happening in the clubs. And that's what I, to this day, that's what moves me. And there's a lot of kind of improvisation and freestyle that can happen, but there are also some codified steps. And I think that that codification is important. And it's important because it's the way it gets passed on. It shouldn't stay there, right? It shouldn't just get frozen there. But there is something about, I think that there is something important about, again, this codification that happens. So
that was all really great. I had really wanted to ask about the relationship between hip hop as it's taught in classes and street dance. So I'm glad that all came out through that. I want to pass on from a request from Eric, which I think is a good correction, and maybe we can take a minute. Imani, we've talked a lot about the handbook so far, but we didn't give the same kind of overview of your book. So maybe before we go to the last couple of questions, you could just give people a sense of what's in behind those covers.
Sure. So the book is titled Dark Matter and Breaking Ciphers, The Life of Africanist Aesthetics in Global Hip Hop. And over the course of 4 chapters, an intro, a coda, and a series of interspersed stories or thick descriptions of my own ethnographic research experiences, I talk about the dance circle, the cypher, as it's the anchor to the book as a whole. But what I came to recognize and pay attention to are the Africanist aesthetics that inform that cypher, that inform the circle and other circle practices in the diaspora. But specifically looking at breaking ciphers gave me room to think about a range of things. I interviewed over 75 primarily breakers, but hip hop dancers of all kinds, and a couple of DJs and a couple of MCs and some event organizers. And it ended up that the kind of primary chapter, the first chapter, engages spirituality and the spirit, and thinking about the breaking ciphers in the context of other African diasporic circle practices, how much spirit is a given. But I think from a hip hop perspective is probably the last thing anybody thinks of, because we're so used to kind of the image of the dance circle as these big spectacular moves and everybody's oohing and eyeing, and then we kind of move on. And so paying attention to the dance, the kinesthetic experience, and the Africanist aesthetics that are operative to that space, the call and response, the kind of the oral kinesthetic space, the feelings of being able to heal, feelings of liberation, feelings of ancestral connection, all of the ways that in other circle practices in the diaspora, such as ring shouts or capoeira rodas or bomba circles, all of the ways that people talk about spirit in those instances come up in hip hop. They come up with breakers, and the practitioners I've interviewed, and that was surprising. And I feel like probably a difficult thing for folks to write about. And so it ended up being the primary thing. If we're going to talk about things that are present and matter, but we don't see or don't know how to recognize, spirit in that became primary. The second chapter focuses on Bronx Tales, but both the experiences of those earlier, not necessarily the first, but the earlier generations of breakers in New York, and specifically the kind of the marks left in breaking culture and in battling culture that to me are remnants of that experience. And so I look at the relationship between how people are talking about what their survival tools and under specific conditions in the South Bronx, and the kind of survival tools that one is expected to have as a breaker in a battle context, and that there's a relationship there, there's overlap in that. My third chapter focuses on B-girls from around the world and what we understand and can learn from paying attention to. If every chapter is a kind of pivot to a different type of cipher, this is if we're thinking about a cipher filled with B-girls from around the world, what comes to the fore in terms of their contribution. And I will say that in the editing process, I'm really deeply appreciative of Sean Crawley, who read a previous draft of the book. And his question for that chapter is like, what is the radical possibilities of B-girls and ciphers? And that was really a driving question for me to not just talk about gender in a kind of binaristic way, even though the discourse in breaking B-boy and B-girl appeared to uphold that, but to think about like what is actually, like, when B-girls break, what's the thing coming out of that? What's being born in those spaces? And what we can get from that when we don't get hemmed up by the kind of expectation that talking about B-girls is only ever to talk about gender. They're practitioners and contributors to the culture. And my fourth chapter continues on this path of thinking about global hip hop and paying attention to all of the ways that folks coming into hip hop culture through, obviously, especially through dance, part of their points of connection are those salient Africanist aesthetics in hip hop that resonate with them in some way. And that as a point of entry, to me, also suggests that hip hop acts as a kind of calibrating force, or Africanist aesthetics acts as a kind of calibrating force in global hip hop. There's something to getting people on the same page. And in the process of thinking about the ways that aesthetically we can read a kind of theorization of what it means to be together, a collective or a community, or to operate across differences to create a thing, which is another way of thinking about what a literal cipher is and is doing. There are some lessons in that, and that have political import, that can attend to questions of coalition building and operating across difference. And then I end with a very short meditation on how and in what ways, and if we can think about and engage Africanist aesthetics online in the way they may or may not get produced in algorithmically in social media spaces and things like that. So that's Dark Matter book.
Thanks so much. That sounds so fantastic. Yeah, that was great. And we have a couple more questions before we wrap up.
Okay.
Rob Drew, do you want to step in?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't know if this is too general a question, but I wonder if something can be said about in the 70s, thinking of hip hop dancing, break dancing as a kind of intervention, how it related to previous forms of popular music dancing, soul, maybe especially disco. Was it break from disco? Was it an intervention? Were there continuities in terms of movement? Or is this question just off base completely? That's it.
Do you want to start, Rosemarie, or do you have an immediate response to anything?
I need to think on it a little bit more.
I mean, I don't think your question is off base at all, and I'm open to you. I would love if you elaborated, because so you're thinking about, is there an influence there or a relationship there?
Yeah, I mean, I know there were DJs who straddled those worlds at the time, DJ Hollywood
Right.
in New York. And I'm just wondering whether there were dancers too, or to what degree breaking or popping and locking and other things you've talked about were connected or distinguished from, or just ways of leaving disco behind, or continuities with it.
I think in terms of continuities, like I'm literally thinking of a club space, and in a club, and especially by the early 80s, young breakers are being invited into the club, as something for the club attendees to see dance. But there's a relationship built in, and there's lots of overlap, precisely because there's those DJ overlaps, there's musical technique overlaps in terms of like establishing a continuity of rhythm to extend the dancing. Those club spaces become incubators, and dancers communicate across maybe their difference, what might be read as a difference in genre. But we're also talking about something like breaking is coming into being, it's coming into formation. There are elements that stuck, but there was a lot of development at the time frame you're talking about. So I feel like the influence is built in, and it extends beyond that moment. So there's always some point on my social media, because I'm connected to a number of breakers on like my Facebook page, where like that clip from Hell's a Poppin' is going to come on, and you see the Lindy dancers, Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, like breakers show that clip, and they're like, they're breaking, like that's hip hop, like this is hip hop. There's no the claims to hip hop, by virtue of its relationship to other genres of music and dance, make hip hop expansive, because people recognize that something is there. Rosemarie mentioned house, and the way that people sometimes include house and sometimes don't include house under hip hop. And it can be, but isn't exclusive to hip hop. But I also know like a lot of those hip hop social dances, as they incubated in clubs, trickled down to me in junior high, but incubated in club spaces. Those club spaces are developing forms precisely because there's also house dancers there, there's breakers there, there's kids who, like, when breaking starts to die out and they're not only no longer invited into certain club spaces, but are actually kicked out or discouraged from doing the floor work. House clubs became a space wherein the dancing was allowed to just be, because it was dance centric. The music dance relationship was centric in a house space. And so that became a place for hip hop dancers of different genres to continue to experiment and play and engage with other dancers, and to then cultivate different kinds of codified movement that will still get taught under the genre of like party dances or house or freestyle, some those things. And so yeah, the relationship is definitely there. And it's always easiest for me to think about it in the literal, like on the ground, person, like face to face, sweating on each other way. If somebody is doing something funky and it might not be the genre you do, it's a contribution to the cypher, and then you got to step up with what you bring to it. And so, yeah, to me, your question, yeah, makes total sense.
Thanks. I want to try in the last sort of 5 minutes that we have here to get this last question in. So I'll ask Lauren Kramer to ask, and maybe because Imani has been doing the bulk of answering for the past couple of questions, Grace and Rosemarie can begin the answers to Lauren.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. This has been absolutely phenomenal. So my question is speaking to form, but when it comes to your work as scholars. And so I've really loved hearing about this encouragement to write, even when we're not certain that we have the language, but also, Grace, as a practitioner, I really am curious about how you think about movement in your writing. Like, how do you address your scholarly form, the way that you make in this context, in a way that somehow speaks to what you're actually writing about. Makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think about, and I think Rosemarie actually does really great with this in her book, but like trying to access all the senses when I'm writing, right? That it's not just what I'm seeing, but what was I feeling? What was I smelling? What was nearby? You know, like when I'm watching dance, am I next to a sweaty body versus sitting in a theater where I'm watching dance this way, right? Thinking about that, but I also think about language, of using language to give it the feeling and not just being descriptive. So
Yeah.
just
I think I'll answer this in two ways. One, I'll out myself as someone who has struggled with writing and less than love writing. I love when it's out and done, but the process has always been difficult. And so one of the things that I realized was that so I would write in the morning, first thing in the morning, and you know, whatever was, I would just write 30 minutes, and then I would go out running. And when I was running, I was realizing that what I had written about was moving through my body in a way that those ideas, as whatever they were being synthesized in a particular way. And that said something to me. So what I started to do was, as I was running, I started to record what was coming up for me as I was running about the ideas I had written about. I'd go home, I would transcribe those ideas, and then integrate them into what I was writing. And that taught me, as someone who has danced for most of my life, I've been dancing since I was 5 years old, and I'm old, that I was in my body. And so it was to think about writing as a purely intellectual, like from the head up kind of enterprise was hamstringing me. And so I thought about that as I wrote. And then the other thing that so I call my book a book project, because I had hundreds of several, at least maybe not 100, but close to 100 hours of video that I analyzed to write the book. And so because it seemed important to me to include some of those videos in the book, I actually have clips of the teaching of movement, not because I wanted to use it as instructional, but as a way for people to engage with the words, but also with the bodies that are moving. I also, it seemed important to me to make those clips short enough that people couldn't just grab them, and then that would take away from, take money out of the pockets of these amazing folks that I worked with. And that was also important. So those are the ways that I've contended with writing about dance. And then maybe I'll say a third thing, and that is, when I teach, I always ask students to reflect on the movement, because if you ask young people, so what did you think about the dance? They're like, well, I liked it. I'm like, or I loved it. I was like, okay, so what do you like about it? So because you have to, it's not something that I think comes organically or naturally to write about dance. And so this to move from description to analysis requires some work. And so I think it's important to teach about that as well.
Yeah, I love the running thing, because I am not a runner, but I will go for a walk, and after a good 45 minutes, I'm like, that's what that was. Oh, that's what I'm trying to figure out how to put into words. Yeah, I feel like one of the things I do encourage with students, and I encourage it because I felt it myself, was like, you have to try something privately. nobody has to see it, but like once you actually learn to start paying attention to your body, you pay attention. Honestly, if I wasn't, I feel like it would be I know the dark matter book would be very different had I not been in a dance department as I was writing the final draft, because I learned quite differently than I anticipated, you know, how to pay attention to the body. And I'd be so super self-conscious because I'm around all these amazing dancers who are trained, but it's really kind of giving yourself the space to just acknowledge what, like, and be with your body, that found really helpful, because it's the little things. Like I took a breaking class after 1 week, my fingers hurt and I was doing a lot more balancing on the side of my foot. I didn't know that was a thing. So it just kind of gives you a different perspective about how of things, and that can fuel how you write. If it's cool, Carl, I would like to I was encouraged to read something, and that for some reason didn't occur to me before we started, but there's a small paragraph from the opening story, or there's a paragraph from the opening story that I would love to read. And this is just something I landed on after many times in different circles. I write, each circle has its own life. Some are intense and tight-knit, others never find their rhythm, dispersing before they ever really begin. From a bird's eye view, the continual formation and dispersal of each cipher has a pattern of pebbles dropped in a pond, rippling endlessly into new tidal flows. After several hours, my sense of time begins to falter when I melt into the collective. There's no, quote, personal space. I feel the bee girl next to me taking in gulps of air as she rises from the floor drenched in sweat. I can feel the chest of the man behind me as he presses forward in an attempt to look overhead. And when he shifts, the tickle of air tells me he's left a sweat spot on my shirt. I can smell the breath of the kid next to me every time he cries out in excitement or disappointment. And I'm leaning on someone I don't know. My locks brush across another's shoulder each time I move for a better view. More so than anything, a heat emanates from our bodies, confounded by a pungent smell of the whole room. A steamy funk rises. The club feels like a sauna with the aroma of a gym, and I am part of it. And so ultimately the book is about what I learned from being part of it.
I would say to Imani that, like, that little description, I saw it happening in front of me. Mm-hmm. And then I started feeling it happening. Like I was you, and that sweaty body, and I could feel it, right? Like that's
thank you.
Kind of the writing, yeah.
Thank you for saying that.
And on that note, thank you to all three of you for joining us here today. And thanks to everybody who came and asked questions. I just want to note that this is the end of this season of PMBiP, and we'll be returning sometime in late August, early September, probably. And a call for presentations is going to go out soon. So if you have books or know of people who have books in progress or about to appear, please keep us in mind and make proposals. And we're also, because Eric is flying off to Europe for next year, we're looking for somebody to sub in and help out on the organizing side. So any regular attendees who'd be interested in joining us in doing the admin side of this, we'd really love to know that. So get in touch. And on that note, thank you, everybody, and have a good summer.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
This was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.